Hello again, everyone. As you can tell from my voice, this is Mrs. Bala once again, coming to you in your headphones. Before we jump into the next unit is titled Natural Law. But before we jump into that, I wanted to make sure that we do a baby review from the previous unit titled Faith and Reason. These are things that you should have learned. Now, if these look confusing to you and you don't know these items, even though the test is finished and even though we may not retest on this until the final exam, it's very important that you go back and read your notes, listen to the videos, read the readings until you understand this information, or even ask me for help when I come back, because this information is not going to disappear. It's going to come. It's going to haunt you, I guess, for the rest of the year. It will return on the final exam, and it will return next semester, believe it or not. So this is like math. You can't forget this. 2 plus 2 is 4. You always need to know that. You can never forget it. Okay, so from the first unit, you were supposed to learn that what we believe to be true will guide our actions. Thus, we have the duty to seek the truth. Otherwise, our actions can be wrong, or more than likely will be wrong if we do not believe that which is true. Faith and reason cannot contradict each other. They flow from the same source, and that is God. If faith and reason contradict each other, one of them is incorrect, or both of them is incorrect. There is such a thing as universal truth, that which is true for all people in all places and at all times. Morality is based on truth. Morality is also universal. So this means that morality never changes. This is actually a really big deal, especially in our culture. Our culture tells us that, whatever you can believe whatever you want. Nobody can tell you anything differently, and that's not true. Okay, morality never changes. If it is wrong to be a racist person, then it was always wrong to be racist, and it will always be wrong to be racist. That will never ever change. So here is a parable about natural law that I learned or heard when I was in college. Okay, so this is not my own story. This is a parable that I heard from Dr. Hittinger at the University of St. Thomas. He is a natural law philosopher, and I would consider him one of the leading experts in the country on natural law. But here is something that he uses in his own class at the University of St. Thomas when he teaches natural law. And I think it's a wonderful parable to explain the truth of natural law. Two battleships were assigned to the training squadron, and they had been at sea on maneuvers in heavy weather for several days. I was serving on lead in the battleship and was on watch on the bridges as night fell, or on the bridge as night fell. The visibility was poor with patchy fog, so the captain remained with me on the bridge, keeping an eye on all activities. Shortly after dark, the lookout on the wing of the bridge reported, "Lights bearing on the starboard bow." "Is it steady or moving astern?" the captain called out. The lookout replied, "It's steady, Captain," which meant we were on a dangerous collision course with that ship. So the captain called out to the signalman, "Tell that ship, we are on a collision course and I advise you to change your course 20 degrees. We waited, and then there came a signal. "It's advisable for you to change your course 20 degrees. So the captain called out and said, "Tell them I'm a captain. Change your course 20 degrees. The response came back, "I'm a seaman second class. You better change your course 20 degrees. So the captain was furious and he yelled, "Tell them that we are a battleship. Change your course 20 degrees. Okay, so what does this mean? Basically, they're about to collide. They're going back and forth, angry at each other and telling each other to move, but no one is moving. So what was the final response that the battleship and the captain received? "I'm a lighthouse." So we changed our course. This parable is a really good example of natural law because you can be a battleship who can, bulldoze over everyone and hurt everyone. But at the end of the day, if you don't listen to the truth and you don't acknowledge the truth, all you're going to do is hurt yourself, right? Because what would have happened to that battleship had they run into the lighthouse? They would have crashed. So it doesn't matter what you believe. It doesn't matter how much power you think you have or how much power you think humanity has over science or over our bodies, over the world. At the end of the day, natural law is the truth, and if we don't pay attention to what natural law teaches us, we're going to hurt ourselves. Does that make sense? If not, go ahead and take a note here to ask me some questions when you come back about this particular parable or about what it teaches about natural law, and we will talk about it. But you need to make sure that you make a note to ask me, otherwise I will not know that you don't understand the parable. All right, guys, before we start discussing natural law specifically, we need to discuss what a law is. So if I asked you, hey, what is a law? Can anybody tell me what a law is? You might be thinking all sorts of things. You might think to yourself, well, a law is something that the government creates to keep us in control. Or a law is something that tells me I can't do something. Or a law is a creation of my parents that, because they don't want me to come home late, whatever. You might be thinking all sorts of things. But you may not know the actual definition of a law. No one maybe has ever asked you to think about the definition of a law. The most expansive and best examination of law, and also natural law, was given to us by St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologiae. If you're not familiar with the Summa, the Summa is Thomas Aquinas's notes, I guess, his teaching notes. If you line up the Summa, it would take up probably an entire bookshelf. If you go to the library at the University of St. Thomas and look at the Summa, it is quite expansive. And here in the picture, you have St. Thomas Aquinas, and he is usually depicted holding a church or even a cross sometimes, and a book. And the reason why he's depicted this way is because he is known as the church father, or the great philosopher who was able to bridge the gap between science and theology, or logic and theology. He was able to bridge the gap between faith and reason, which you should know what that means because of Fides et Ratio. Also, if you notice, he is depicted with the Eucharist, or the Eucharist on his chest. That's because he was also able to see the beatific vision late in life, and he was also a great lover of the Eucharist and the Mass. So there's a lot here in this picture about St. Thomas Aquinas, but what I do want you to know is that he gave us the most expansive treatment of law and natural law itself. St. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa defined law as an ordinance of reason for the common good, promulgated by him who has the care of the community. And if you look here, it's Summa Theologiae, first part of the second part, question 90, article 4. That's the way that the Summa is set up. There are multiple parts of the Summa, and that's how you find I guess, objects in the Summa if you're doing research, which you will do later on this year in this class. But let's go through this particular definition. There are 4 parts to the definition of law, and you do need to know all 4 parts. Yes, you do. I will ask you to list these 4 parts on a test, or on the next test. An ordinance of reason, which means it is illogical. Okay, so any law that is going to exist or going to be created must be reasonable, must be logical. It must also be for the common good. It must protect all people, or it must be good for all people. It can't just be for the rich people, or for, a certain group of people or a certain race. It has to be for all people. It must be promulgated. And if you do not know what promulgated means, it means that it must be known, or it must be declared. So people must know it's a law. And it must be given by the one who has care of the community. So, for example, I cannot make a law about Houston, Texas. I don't have that right. I can make a law about my classroom, but I can't make a law about Houston. I can't even make a law about St. Pius, okay, because I don't have that right. Anyone who's going to create a law, an actual law, must have the appropriate authority of the community. So there are 4 parts to the law according to Thomas Aquinas. It must be logical. It must be an ordinance of reason, so it must be logical. It must be for the common good. This is number 2. It must be promulgated. That's number 3. And number 4, it must be given by the one who has care of the community. If any one of these 4 aspects are missing, it is not a just law. So now that we have discussed the definition of law, here are the 4 types of law that exist. So when we talk about the types of law quiz that you're going to take, Yes, you're going to take a quiz on the types of law. These are the 4 types of law that will appear on your quiz. So please pay attention, okay? So there are 4 types of law. The first one is eternal law. It is the intellect or the will of God who commands the natural order. That comes from St. Augustine. Thomas Aquinas called it the divine wisdom which directs all movement. So don't worry about the visual aspect of these laws just yet. On the next slide, there is a visual aspect of the laws. So don't stress out too much about these definitions. Just look at the definitions as I read them. And then I'll give you a visual representation of the laws on the next slide, okay? I realize that after I just read the eternal law definition, it was probably a little stressful, but don't stress out, it's okay. Okay, so the natural law, which is what this unit is about, the natural law is the rule of reason inherent to the nature of man, okay? So because of man's rational nature, he or she, I'm just using man generally speaking, man has the capacity to know reason, to know logic. It is human participation in the eternal law, and human beings can come to know the truth concerning morality because of natural law. We'll talk about that again in this entire unit, so don't stress out, it's okay. The third type of law is the divine law or the revealed law. This is very easy. You should remember this from your freshman year in theology. These are the laws that are revealed in Scripture and the laws that were revealed by Jesus Christ himself. So these are things that we cannot know unless God revealed them or unless Jesus revealed them. So those are things like the Trinity. Okay, we don't know anything about the Trinity. That's a revealed law. Or love your neighbor as you love yourself. Those are things that we can't know according to natural law. Love your enemies. Jesus, declared that we should love our enemies. That's something that we can't know naturally. That's something that had to be revealed to us. And then there is the fourth type of law is human law. These are particular laws or determinations that we have created to help organize our community or to help organize our city or our country or any of those things. Things like driving on the right side of the road, okay, versus the left side of the road. Those are human laws. So we drive on one side of the road in America, they drive on another side of the road in Europe. Is one way right or wrong? No, those are just human laws, okay? So here is the visual of the 4 laws that I promised to give you from the previous slide. As you can see, we have the 4 types of law here. We have the eternal law, the divine law, the natural law, and the human law. As you can see, the eternal law, which is God's divine wisdom, right? It encompasses everything that exists. It encompasses all laws. Any good, authentic, and true laws come from eternal law itself. Again, the eternal law encompasses all aspects of revealed and perceived truth. So remember from the previous slide, the eternal law is God's divine wisdom or God's ordering of the cosmos. It is basically creation itself in the way that God has set it up. That is the eternal law. Okay, that's the simplest way to say it. The divine law, as you can see, is a portion of the eternal law. It is the portion of the law that God has chosen to reveal to us. So those are things that we cannot know on our own. Divine law is not a part of natural law. It is only and solely revealed by God. It does not fall into the realm of naturally knowable truths. Remember, the example I gave you was, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. That's an example of a law revealed by Jesus Christ. That's not something that we would come to on our own. Okay, you know how humans are, how humanity is. It'd be very difficult for us to ever come to that conclusion. I don't think a human being would come to that conclusion. Jesus revealed it. That's the only reason we know that truth. So remember, divine law or revealed law are laws that were revealed in Scripture or in the life of Jesus Christ. So eternal law and divine law. So now we have natural law. And as you can see, natural law is also part of the eternal law, but it is a special participation in the eternal law. Because human beings have an intellect, they have the ability to know the truth about the world around them. They have the ability to know things like science, math, chemistry, physics, calculus. We have the ability to know those things. Those are a part of natural law. But also, believe it or not, morality is also a part of natural law. Morality is something that we also are able to know based on our human intellect and based on our participation in God's eternal law or in God's intellect. So human beings have the ability to know the truth about morality as well. Let me say that again in a different way. Human beings have the ability to know the truth about right and wrong. Okay, that is what natural law is. The ability to know the truth about right and wrong. And I'll give you a better definition of natural law. Don't worry about it. Don't stress out just yet, but just look at the visual, okay? Natural law is a part of eternal law, but divine law is not included in natural law. So pay attention to that. And then last but not least, we have human law. The human laws are things, as I said before, things that help us organize our world or organize our country or organize our city, however you want to look at it. Human laws, we can look at even something as small as St. Pius, okay? St. Pius has human laws. Things like, do not bully. That's an example of a human law that is a part of natural law. Do you see how some of human law is overlapping with natural law and divine law? Do you see that? See, some of the human laws come from natural law and some of our human laws come from divine law. So, for example, like I use the example of bullying. Bullying is a part of natural law. You're not supposed to bully people, okay? You should know that. Divine law. Let's see, I'm trying to come up with some examples of laws from St. Pius that are a part of divine law. How about love the people who you don't really get along with? That would be a good example of a law that we have here at St. Pius that comes from divine law. Like, it might be really hard to be nice to people who you dislike or who dislike you, but you should. You shouldn't be rude to them. You shouldn't hate them. You shouldn't talk about them behind their back. You should love them. And then you have a part of the human law that sticks out and is all by itself. Yes, it's still a part of eternal law, but the reason why I have it sticking out here all by itself is because there are some things that aren't really a part of natural law or divine law. That would be like, don't chew gum. That's an example of a human law that is an actual human law, but it doesn't really fall into natural law and it doesn't fall into divine law. It is just something that we created for ourselves here at St. Pius. So, another example of a human law that doesn't fall under natural law or divine law is, dropping off the students at the student drop-off, following the, versus dropping off a student somewhere else. I mean, those are just laws that we've created to govern ourselves, okay? So the way that I'm going to ask you to quiz over this information is I'm going to give you this picture here, and it's going to be blank, and you're going to have to fill it in. So you're going to need to know that eternal law encompasses everything. You're going to need to know where divine law belongs, where human law belongs, and where natural law belongs. So make sure that you study this for your quiz, because this is what your quiz will look like. So now that you know the definition of law, generally speaking, and now that you know the 4 types of law, we are going to spend more time focusing on the natural law because that's what this unit is about. As you can see here, I've gone back to St. Thomas Aquinas and the Summa Theologiae because the most expansive treatment of the natural law can be found in St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae. St. Thomas Aquinas was the philosopher who had the best treatment of law and natural law, the best treatment of natural law in history. I'm going to say that again. So throughout history and all the philosophers that have ever existed, St. Thomas Aquinas had the best and most expansive treatment of law and natural law. When you study natural law, you must study Thomas Aquinas, okay? Because that's how foundational his work is, okay? Anyone who studies natural law must and should study Thomas Aquinas. So here's what he says about natural law. He says that all things partake in some way in the eternal law. So all things partake in some way in the eternal law. Remember the eternal law, that's the law that encompasses everything. Namely, the eternal law is imprinted on them, and they derive their respective inclinations to their proper acts and ends. The rational creature is subject to divine providence in a more excellent way. The rational creature has a share of the eternal reason, whereby it has a natural inclination to its proper act and end. So if you look at the little bubble next to St. Thomas Aquinas' head over on the left side of the slide, St. Thomas Aquinas says that we discern what is good and what is evil. So here is a very, very dense piece of work from St. Thomas Aquinas. And if you read Aquinas, you'll understand that Aquinas is dense. So you can read maybe 3 sentences, and he'll say a lot in 3 sentences, which is what happened here. All things partake in some way the eternal law. So all things, he means everything that exists, birds, cats, dogs, humans, everything that exists partakes in some way in the eternal law. The eternal law is imprinted on them. Meaning, so if I have a cat, or if I am a cat, the eternal law is imprinted on me in a certain way. That's what gives me my nature, my cat nature. So if I'm a cat and I have claws and I kill, mice and birds, and I like to sunbathe, that's what my cat does, and, I like to curl up and sleep a certain way, that is me participating in the eternal law, because the eternal law has been imprinted on me. And that's what's given me my cat nature, right? I'm going to say that again, just in case you got confused. Everything that exists has a certain nature, and the nature has been imprinted on them, and that is the way that everything participates in the eternal law. Now, Aquinas says they derive their respective inclinations to their proper acts and ends. That just means that they have a certain nature, that every creature that exists has a certain nature to help it achieve its end, or its goal. Okay, so if I'm going to go back to a cat has a certain nature that has been imprinted on it to help it live a cat life. That's the easiest way that I can say it, okay? That's the easiest way that I can let you know what that means. So now let's talk about humans and human participation in eternal law. St. Thomas Aquinas says, if you go back to the paragraph, the rational creature is subject to divine providence in a more excellent way. The rational creature has a share of the eternal reason, whereby it has a natural inclination to its proper act and end. So this basically means that the rational creature, which is a human being, so that's us, we have a soul that has been imprinted, or that has an imprint of the eternal law. But we have a special imprint of the eternal law. We have the intellect, which allows us to participate in God's intellect, and that is the way that we know truths about the world around us, is that our soul has a share of the eternal reason. The human soul, we'll learn about in the next unit. Don't worry about it. Don't stress about it too much, okay? It's just the human soul. We have a certain intellect, a rational intellect, that allows us to participate in God's intellect. And because we participate in God's intellect, we have the ability to know what is good for human beings and what is bad for human beings. This is why Aquinas says, if you look at the little bubble, we discern what is good and what is evil. So because we have a rational nature, we have the ability to know what is good for humans and what is evil for humans, or what is bad for humans. In terms of behavior, and we'll talk, actually the natural law is much more expansive than that, but for our purposes, we have the ability to act a certain way and to know what is good and what is evil because of our rational intellect that participates in God's rational intellect. So you might be thinking to yourself,
hey guys, this is Mrs. Balakirny. I am giving you guys some digital notes to help you through natural law. As you can see, we are on the cover page of C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. The first book of Mere Christianity is called Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe, which is kind of an important title because C.S. Lewis is saying that morality, quote unquote, right and wrong, gives us a clue as to the meaning of the universe. The very first chapter, or the first section that you guys read in class, is Proof of the Natural Law, which is what we will start now. In section 1 of book 1 of Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis discusses quarreling. He says that quarreling is trying to show that the other man is wrong, and there would be no sense in trying to do that unless you and he had some sort of agreement as to what right and wrong are. C.S. Lewis raises a very interesting point here. He says that only humans are capable of quarreling. Animals are not capable of quarreling in the way that we are. Animals fight. Animals fight over territory, over resources, over food, and things like that. They cannot sit down and have a conversation about the best way to distribute resources or food. They merely fight, and the strongest one wins. With humans, it's vastly different. Obviously, there are situations where humans fight, or there are countries that fight over resources, but C.S. Lewis is talking about something much more basic than war or something along those lines. C.S. Lewis is talking about two people who are quarreling or discussing any sort of topic that they disagree about. It could be a game, it could be a movie, it could be anything. The fact that we quarrel, the fact that one person attempts to convince the other person that he or she is wrong, demonstrates that there is something that we all agree on. There is some sort of standard of truth or standard of decency that we all know and that we all agree on. Otherwise, I would not waste my time trying to convince you about truth or right and wrong if I didn't think that there was truth or that there was a standard of right and wrong. The next issue that C.S. Lewis raises in Book 1 is the definition or the characteristic of the law. Notice that we are not calling it natural law yet, but he's calling it the law of human nature. He says that it is called natural because one does not have to be taught it. He insists that humans are born with the innate ability to know the standard of right and wrong. He says it is called natural because it pertains to human nature. Again, when you act in accord with natural law, you are acting in accord with your own nature. Remember, don't forget, human nature is rational. Thus, following the natural law is rational, or following your own nature. One interesting aspect that C.S. Lewis talks about is whether or not every single person who's ever existed knows this law. He says that yes, absolutely, everyone who's ever existed knows this law. It's universal. That is why it's universal. It is the same for all people in all places at all times. He does admit that you will find one or two persons that he calls quote-unquote odd. He says that, of course, there will be one or two odd persons who do not know the law, but he says this is very similar to being colorblind or something along those lines. That there are some human beings who are colorblind, but for the most part, the human beings have the ability to see color. Same thing with natural law. There are a few quote-unquote odd persons, like C.S. Lewis says, that are not capable of accessing or making the decision to follow natural law, but that is not true for the entirety of the human race. For the most part, the entirety of the human race does have access to natural law. It is universal. Unlike the other laws of the universe, laws of physics, calculus, those sorts of things, gravity, a human being can choose to act against natural law. We cannot choose to act against gravity. We don't have a choice. But we can choose to act against our own nature and against the law. I don't know if you guys remember me discussing this and saying that, my cat, Emmy, doesn't really have a choice. She cannot be anything other than Emmy, the cat. She cannot do anything other than what she does as a cat. That is her nature, and she must fulfill it. But human beings do have the ability to act against their nature, and this is where the concept of sin enters the picture. We'll get there much later, but just keep that in your mind. And as a quick reminder, see the note on the bottom, moral actions are those which abide by human nature, by that which is rational. Because human nature does not change, natural law is immutable. Basically, this means that because human nature will never be anything other than rational nature, the natural law does not change. It is based upon your human nature. Again, I'm going to remind you that the moral code that helps us follow natural law is unchangeable. Some of you might say, well, what about, some societies that commit these terrible human sacrifices or something along those lines? And really, C.S. Lewis discusses this in The Abolition of Man in the Illustrations of the Tao, which I have posted online for you under the Natural Law folder online. C.S. Lewis actually brings major moral codes and puts them side by side and points out that for the most part, all of the major moral codes that we know of have followed very, very similar rules. Again, he uses this as another example of the truth of natural law and the fact that natural law is unchangeable even across civilizations. C.S. Lewis himself says that natural law transcends civilization. It goes or spans beyond just one civilization. Every civilization that's existed can know these truths. The first standard of natural law, the truth that every person knows, is do good and avoid evil. Please write this down. Please note this. Please remember this. I'm going to ask you this on the final exam. The first standard of the natural law is do good and avoid evil. This is a truth, again, this is a truth that every human person knows because he or she is a human person. Every human person knows this truth. That is why it is called the first standard of natural law. You may recall from our previous discussion concerning Thomas Aquinas, Thomas states that there are certain inclinations that flow forth from the rational nature of the human person. These inclinations help the human person achieve his or her final end, or the good, of achieving, the fullness of rational nature. There are 5 very basic inclinations that we all share. The preservation of one's own life is the very most basic, and then if you go towards the bottom of the graphic that you see here, those are less basic inclinations, but they're still inclinations that we all share because of our rational nature. There are positive laws that flow forth from these inclinations. Positive laws mean thou shalt do these things. And there are prohibitive laws that flow forth from these inclinations, and that means thou shalt not do these things. So the most basic inclination is the preservation of one's own life. This means that because we want to preserve our own life, and we work to preserve our own life, we should recognize that other people have that same desire and same inclination. This means that we should protect other human life, we should protect our own life, and we have the right to engage in self-defense if we are challenged, or if the preservation of our life is challenged. Murder, suicide, and torture are prohibited because of this inclination. Again, this is a philosophical level. This is not a theological discussion at the moment. If you note for a second that murder and suicide and torture are all included in this thou shalt not kill commandment, which is a command from God, but it's also true to natural law. So you will see a lot of the natural law in the Ten Commandments, because again, if it's true for natural law, well then it's true for the Ten Commandments. That which God commands is true because God is truth itself. The next inclination that we share is procreation. We desire fidelity in children. Again, some people do have a vocation to the single life, therefore this is slightly different. But that strong desire to procreate and to have children or family is still there in the single life. It's just that the family or the children, quote unquote, are just considered differently. Like, for some teachers consider their students as children or their school as family, and that is true, especially for St. Pius. For those who have the strong inclination and good to procreate and enter into marriage, that marriage is a positive law and the family institution is a positive law that flows forth to protect this inclination or good. There are prohibitive laws that flow forth. Those are the sexual ethics laws. We will discuss these in great detail in the spring. But all you need to know for this moment is that because of natural law, the sexual ethics flows forth from natural law and our rational nature. The third inclination we share are the rational faculties. Again, you have heard me say this a million times already, that we desire to seek the truth. We want knowledge. Therefore, the positive law is the allowing people to develop the virtues of the intellect. Also, and promote learning. The prohibitive laws are the suppression of truth. That would be things like lying, some sort of government control of media, that sort of thing, and there are institutions that uphold these inclinations, like schools and universities. The next inclination we share is the concern of others and sociability. We are, as human beings, social creatures. We naturally form societies. We naturally form communities. That is very natural for us. I mean, if you think about it, St. Pius is a little community. Your family is the first unit of society. Your family is a society. The positive laws that flow forth from that is developing relationships, defending the state, and respecting the authority. Now, that does not just mean the authority of, the governor or the president. This includes respecting the authority of your teachers, of your parents, of your elders. It's just the respect of authority from those who have come before you and who have laid the path for you. The prohibitive laws there are destroying relationships, lying and gossip, anything that will hurt the society of which you belong. And then the institutions, you've got the politics, community clubs, professional associations, again, the family, schools, that sort of thing. Anything that you belong to is considered a society. And then the last inclination is to seek a higher being. The positive law that flows forth from that is to obey your conscience and to worship God in your religion. This is where we get the freedom of religion, that sort of thing. The prohibitive laws are blasphemy, violating your conscience, or forcing other people to violate their consciences. And then obviously we have the religious institutions and associations. Again, religious freedom falls under this category or this inclination. We should have religious freedom because we all desire to seek religion or a higher good or God. The next section of C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity that you read is extremely important. It's extremely important to remember and to note that natural law is not an instinct. I will say that again. Natural law is not an instinct. Instinct is a strong desire. The example that I always like to use is the fight or flight instinct. Fight means, if I'm seeing an aggressor or something that is attacking me, I evaluate it. I either fight it because I'm stronger than it, or I run away because I think that it is stronger than me. Those are instincts. Natural law is the decider of which instinct is appropriate. Natural law is the standard of which instinct is appropriate. Now again, C.S. Lewis notes correctly that there are no bad instincts. Instincts are good. They help us survive. That is how we are here in terms of the evolutionary process. But instincts can be used incorrectly. I love the example that C.S. Lewis uses concerning the piano. I think it's brilliant. He says that the keys on the piano board are our instincts in terms of the analogy. The sheet music is natural law, or represents natural law. There's no such thing as a bad key on the keyboard of the piano. All the keys are good. It's just that in terms of the standard or the musical sheet that you're supposed to be playing, there are right times to play certain keys, and there are wrong times to play certain keys depending on the music that you're using. So natural law is this way with our instincts. There are right instincts to use depending on the situation, and wrong instincts to use or give into depending on the situation. One of the interesting things that C.S. Lewis says concerning instinct and natural law is that natural law usually tells us to side with the weaker of the two impulses. So if we find ourselves in a situation that seems to be, we seem to have conflicting impulses or instincts, usually, like C.S. Lewis says, natural law will tell us to side with the weaker. So let me give the example of the burning building. If I am, sleeping at night and I wake up to the smell of smoke and my alarm going off, the first thing I'm going to do the first thing that I'm going to think that I need to do is, oh my goodness, I need to get out of here. I need to save my life. But there's some other person in the house that I need to worry about. I need to worry about my kids or my family, my that sort of thing, my siblings. So my first impulse is, save my life, run, go. But my second impulse is to stop and save my brothers and sisters or my family members. And to be honest with you, saving my brothers and sisters is a scary thought, because that means that I have to stay in this burning house longer than I otherwise would. If I were just worried about myself, I would run out and I would be safe and sound, no problems. But if I had to look for my, baby brother or sister, that's scary. And you actually have to tell your instincts or tell your body to overcome that instinct or that impulse to run, so you could help your brother and sister. That's an example of the natural law forcing us or telling us to side with the weaker of the two impulses. It's scary to stay in that burning building, but you know it's the right thing to do because you know you need to save your baby brother and sister. Another example is Bobby DeLauder from Ghost of the Mississippi. You guys can give me really great examples of everything that Bobby went through because he was doing the right thing. His wife left him. His, family members were angry because they did not agree with what he was doing. He got, had bomb threats. His children were being beaten up at school. His car was getting smashed, and it must have been frightening for him. But he knew, according to natural law, that he needed to do the right thing, and he needed to overcome that impulse of fear. He needed to do the right thing, but his natural law, or his participation in natural law, would not let him rest, which is the way that it should be and is for all people. The information on this slide is simply a reiteration of what I've already said concerning instincts. All of our instincts are good, all of them, but some of them are more appropriate depending on the situation. Again, natural law is that which judges which instinct is appropriate for which situation. Please make sure that you read this and that you remember and get this information down. C.S. Lewis brings up another extremely important point concerning natural law. Natural law is not social norm. I'm going to say that again. Natural law is not always the social norm, and it is not dictated by the social norm. Just because other people think it's normal or good, that does not make it right. Okay, in terms of natural law, the natural law does not change. Society and convention and social norms can change. So traffic laws change, some of the clothes that we wear, the way we wear our hair, jewelry, the music we listen to, those kinds of things change. However, that standard that tells us the basic truths of morality and the basic truths of our human existence do not change. There have been situations where society is and can be wrong. The reason why we watched the Ghost of the Mississippi movie is because we wanted to demonstrate that just because society says something is acceptable, that does not make it right. So Mississippi in the 1960s had quite a few issues in terms of morality. The anger, the violence, the hatred, the racism, all of those things were acceptable in terms of society of the time, but that absolutely positively did not make it okay. The standard of right and wrong did not change regardless of what the society believed. This brings us to a question that C.S. Lewis asks you in the reading. Which society would you prefer to live in? Which one do you want to live in? Would you want to live in a Christian society, a Nazi society, Mississippi in the 60s, or America today? Before you answer me, or before you even think to yourself, wow, which society would I want to live in? C.S. Lewis wants you to think about that standard that you're using to judge society. Before you even make a choice, you have already decided that there's some sort of standard that tells us that one society is better than another. So, for example, we automatically know that we can cross out a Nazi society or Mississippi in 1960 because we know those are inherently wrong, that the social norms in those societies are inherently wrong and they do not follow natural law or the standards of natural law. I think some of you might choose between Christian society and America today based on how you feel about Christianity in America. But again, your choice doesn't inherently matter. What does matter is the fact that you are measuring these moral ideas based on a standard that you know is true. Again, here is the quote from C.S. Lewis. The moment you say that one set of moral ideas can be better than another, you are, in fact, measuring them both by a standard, saying that one of them conforms to the standard more nearly or closely than the other. But the standard that measures the two things is something different from either. So that which measures the Christian society, Nazi society, Mississippi in the 60s, or America is not the same as the societies themselves. You are comparing the societies to the standard of morality, which is independent from societies. Again, this is just to reiterate the point that society does not determine morality. That society does not dictate or determine natural law or morality. It should be, hopefully, the other way around. And finally, this brings us to one more conversation about the social norm. The question always arises, well, what happens when the social norm or the social convention does not coincide with natural law? And I've kind of already given you the answer. I know I've used the example of Martin Luther King Jr. in class already when I've said that I've quoted Martin Luther King Jr. saying, an unjust law is no law at all. In fact, Martin Luther King Jr. was quoting Augustine. And remember, I told you that if a law does not follow all three aspects of a just law, given the definition given by Aquinas, then it's not a just law. And if it's not a just law, then it is not a true law. When we have laws in society that go against what you know is right, then we have the duty to act in accord with the truth, even when the rest of society does not. We also have the duty to bring justice to current situations that do not coincide with natural law. You'll see this with John Paul in Evangelium Vitae. John Paul says very fervently, very fervently is a double, as they mean the same thing. John Paul says fervently that we should not follow laws that are not just. We have the moral obligation to do what is right, regardless of what the law says. It does not matter what the rest of society does. What matters is that we follow the truth. That is following natural law. The perfect example of going against social norm and following natural law, I believe, is Bobby DeLauder and Medgar Evers' wife, Myrlie Evers. Even though it was, like I said, dangerous for Bobby to pursue this case, he ultimately made the right decision according to truth and according to natural law. He knew that it was wrong for Byron de la Beckwith to get away with the murder of Medgar Evers because it was unjust. Not only was it unjust for Medgar and his family, but it was unjust for the entire civil rights movement. It was unjust for all of humanity. And so the pictures that I provided here for you are pictures that you probably have seen before after the movie. This is Medgar Evers on the left. This is a picture of Medgar Evers' funeral where Myrlie is kissing him goodbye, and Medgar's brother, the man from the radio station, is next to Myrlie Evers. And then you have a picture of Bobby DeLauder and Byron de la Beckwith at the very end on the bottom right. This brings us to our third and final section of Mere Christianity, which is titled The Reality of the Law. C.S. Lewis brings up a few interesting points. Again, as you've seen, almost everything that C.S. Lewis has discussed has been interesting, at least according to my opinion. But C.S. Lewis starts by talking about a tree or a stone, and he says that we really can't blame a tree or a stone for the way or the manner in which they behave or the manner in which they act, because they have no intentionality. They are merely acted upon by forces of nature. So he uses the example of a tree that says, given the weather and the soil, the tree could not have been any different. So if a tree is not producing fruit or a tree is not producing the shade that you would like, it's not really the tree's fault. You can't go and blame a tree for something that is happening, because really the tree is just being acted upon. That is not the same for human beings. As you can see in the PowerPoint here, it says that you cannot blame a tree or a stone, but you can blame a human being for his or her actions, because human beings have intentionality. Human beings can intend harm, or they can intend good. He talks about the example of someone who trips him, and he uses the two examples. What man number one accidentally trips me, and man number two trips me or attempts to trip me. And he says, I'm not angry except perhaps for a moment before I come to my senses with a man who trips me up by accident. See, there's that intentionality there. See, if it's an accident, the man didn't mean to attempt to trip him, so it was an accident. I am angry with a man, C.S. Lewis says, who tries to trip me up even if he does not succeed. Yet the first has hurt me and the second has not. You see, intention is extremely important in human behavior. Human beings are not merely acted upon, human beings act themselves. The next discussion that C.S. Lewis uses in Mere Christianity is utilitarianism. Now I know that he does not use that word himself, but you should remember from your freshman year what utilitarianism is. Utilitarianism is a philosophical worldview that posits or asserts if something is good or if an action is good, it must also be useful. Let me, switch that up a little bit. If something is useful, it is also morally good. The example that C.S. Lewis uses to disprove this point is the example of a traitor. He says, in war, each side may find a traitor on the other side very useful. But though they call him and pay him, they regard him as human vermin. So you cannot say that what we call decent behavior in others is simply the behavior that happens to be useful for us. Again, here C.S. Lewis is combating utilitarianism. Natural law does not always tell us to choose the action that is useful. Let's keep going back to the example that we had in class from Ghosts of the Mississippi. I might argue that Bobby DeLauder's actions in Ghosts of Mississippi were not useful at all. In fact, they harmed him. They harmed his family. And in the end, he knew that even though it was not useful and even though it was not really the safest choice to make, he knew that he was doing the right thing. Bobby DeLauder knew that he had to continue this work of justice even though it wasn't very useful. So again, C.S. Lewis uses the example of a traitor to discuss the fact that just because something is useful, that does not mean it is moral. And I love the examples that C.S. Lewis gives. He says, as for decent behavior in ourselves, I suppose it's pretty obvious that it does not mean the behavior that pays. Again, let me say that again. Decent behavior does not always mean that it is the behavior that pays, quote unquote. It means things like being content with 30 shillings when you might have got 3 pounds. 30 shillings is less than 3 pounds, in case you're wondering. Or doing schoolwork honestly when it would have been easy to cheat. Leaving a girl alone when you would like to make love to her. Staying in dangerous places when you could go somewhere safer. And keeping promises that you would rather not keep. And telling the truth even when it makes you look like a fool. Again, natural law, if you remember, natural law usually tells us to side with the weaker of the two instincts. And it's the same, I think C.S. Lewis is bringing up the same argument here in this paragraph that I just read to you. Again, doing schoolwork honestly when it would be easier to cheat. How many times have we discussed this in class? How many times have I said, look, it's so easy to cheat. It's so easy. But is it the right thing to do? No. Is it better to get a B on your own merits than an A by cheating? According to natural law and according to moral behavior and the gospel of truth, the answer is it's better to get a B on your own merits rather than stealing someone else's work. So again, C.S. Lewis is using this example to just demonstrate, or these examples to demonstrate, that just because something is useful, that does not make it right. It does not make it morally good. And then, quite sad to say that this brings us to our conclusion of our discussion concerning natural law with C.S. Lewis. There are a couple of things that I want to make sure that I cover before the end of this video / PowerPoint, and a couple of them are on your last page of your reading, which is technically the question page. So number 5, I give you a couple of sentences that I ask you to explain in your own words. Men ought to be unselfish. They ought to be fair. Not that men are unselfish, nor that they like being unselfish, but they ought to be. The moral law, or the law of human nature, is not simply a fact about human behavior in the same way as the law of gravitation is, or maybe simply a fact about how heavy objects are, or how heavy objects behave. On the other hand, it is not a mere fancy, for we cannot get rid of the idea, and he's talking about natural law here, we cannot get rid of the idea, and most of the things we say and think about men would be reduced to nonsense if we did. This is an extremely, extremely important important section of sentences, as I tell you in your question sheet. C.S. Lewis is saying that natural law is not something that explains human behavior. The law of gravitation explains the behavior of a stone when it falls, or explains the behavior of things that fall. That is not what natural law is. Natural law is not an explanation of the way humans currently behave or the way humans choose to behave. Natural law is an explanation of the way humans ought to behave. There's an extremely important word that I slipped in there, and the answer, that word is ought. How ought humans behave? How should humans behave? That is the natural law. Do all people feel natural law pressing on them? This is question number 6. Absolutely, yes. The answer is yes. We've already discussed this. All human beings, because of their rational nature, feel natural law pressing on them. And this brings us to our last question, which is extremely important. Again, all of this is extremely important. I feel like I've been saying that a lot. Think about someone from Ghost of the Mississippi, or any sort of era or in location in the United States. Someone might assert that a man or woman is racist because he or she was raised to be racist. Why would C.S. Lewis deny this statement? Why would C.S. Lewis say that being raised in a racist society is not an excuse for racism? I'll give you a second to think. C.S. Lewis says, and he is following the tradition of many great and wise thinkers. I mean, we're talking Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas. Many of the great natural law philosophers and theologians have argued that your upbringing, or a human's upbringing, is really not an excuse for sin because of rational nature. I don't know if you remember our discussion from Aquinas, or you should be reading Aquinas or looking at the notes online. Aquinas says that the universal aspects of the natural law, those 5 precepts or inclinations that we all have, human beings all know those. They absolutely, everyone knows those precepts. Now, we have difficulty putting them into practice concerning the particulars. Sometimes we disagree on the particulars, or some people can be wrong concerning the particulars. But every single human being, because of rational nature, has access to those 5 inclinations and has access to the universal principles of natural law. The first universal principle of natural law is do good and avoid evil. That is something every single human being knows. And there is no reason to be raised to be steeped in sin. I really think that it's possible to get, to a certain point in your life where you do follow actions blindly, where you do things blindly because of your culture, because of your peers, because of your music, of TV, of whatever it is that rules you. But there is a certain point in your human life where you will come to start to investigate the world around you, and you will investigate what you believe. You will ponder, what does it mean to be human? Why am I here? How should I treat people? You will start thinking about these things, and you will start questioning life. And this is when you will feel the natural law pressing upon you most heavily. It's when you start to look around and stop to think. And you realize, if I've been raised to believe that, certain people are not as good as me, is that true? The answer, according to natural law, which you do have access to in your heart and soul and in your mind, you have access to know that the answer is no, that everyone is equal, that racism, there's no excuse for that at all whatsoever. No matter how you were raised, no matter what your society tells you, you have the duty and the obligation to not only know what the right thing is to do, but to also act upon it. This is one of the many reasons why it is so important to stand up and say something when you see a very clear injustice. It is so important to not let it go, to stand up and say, I'm not okay with this, I recognize this injustice, and I'm not going to stand for this, and I will not be silent until it's fixed. I think that some people feel this more strongly than others, or some people feel this sense of justice and duty more strongly than other people, but everyone has it. Everyone has access to this desire for justice and desire for goodness. We just have to stop and think, and that is what we will continue to discuss this year.